Hi, I'm Steve Kepp, co-founder of From Day One, our forum on corporate values. Thanks for joining today's webinar. It has the title, Emotion Isn't Enough, Leveraging the Brain to Create Meaningful Experiences. Now, it's well established that creating a customer experience, one that resonates and connects, is crucial to the success of an organization. Nevertheless, many CX efforts fail, either in creating the desired emotions or in creating the desired outcome. Why does this happen? And is there a way to resolve these inconsistencies? Contemporary behavioral science and neuroscience research shows us that there are layers of processing in the brain that interact with customer experience, often in counterintuitive ways, creating disconnects between attitudes and behaviors. Now, with a deeper understanding of these underlying phenomena, you can reliably connect with customers and create powerful experiences. Among the things you'll learn in our webinar today is why well-conceived customer experience efforts sometimes fail, and how our brains are wired to make decisions and judgments. Our partner in presenting this webinar today is BVA Nudge Unit, a global consultancy that combines behavioral science and sectorial expertise to drive successful behavior change and to build enduring capabilities and deliver measurable results. Now, a few quick logistical items before I introduce our speaker. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand soon after the event, so you can look out for an email in about 24 hours with the link. And look out for a written account of the conversation soon on our website at fromday1.co. At about 15 minutes before the top of the hour, we'll have a Q&A session. You can submit your questions anytime, starting now, using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, with today's program. Our speaker is John Burkhart, PhD, a behavioral economist, neuroscientist, and senior advisor for BVA Nudge Unit. John has a degree in psychology from Duke. He earned his PhD at Wake Forest University, and he teaches at Columbia. So John, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here just a moment. Let's see, this worked once before. And there's always that question mark as to whether or not it will work again. Steve, is it being shared correctly? I'm going to assume that is a yes. So welcome. And again, thank you for joining us. I recognize that it is early in the year, that most of us are still kind of getting into the swing of things, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us here today and hopefully learn a bit about what's going on and how we can create a better, more engaging, more meaningful customer experience through understanding how the brain works and how we can leverage certain phenomena and knowledge we have around the brain. So by way of agenda, we have a few things we want to go over today. Going to start off just introducing myself and BVA Nudge Unit. We want to talk about what CX is. It's always good to level set and understand what we are actually talking about. And from that, look at why does CX sometimes fail? We have a good understanding of what CX is, why it works, how it should work. So why do good campaigns sometimes not work the way we think they should? From this, we want to go and talk about some principles of design, drawing from our understanding and knowledge of behavioral science and neuroscience, and how these fields interact on a different layer of processing with what we know and understand about CX. And we're going to conclude with a case study from BVA Nudge Unit's own work, looking at how we used an integrated CX approach to help build out an organizational strategy that engages and leverages the behavior of employees internally. So first of all, who is BVA Nudge Unit? What is this organization for whom I work? We are a behavioral science and behavioral economics agency. We have built out a number of proprietary behavioral science tools. We draw on enormous amounts of experience and expertise in terms of across all myriad fields: psychology, clinical assessment, market research, applied neuroscience. And we integrate all of these to create interventions and strategy towards driving behavioral conversion and driving organizational outcomes. And you'll get a sense of what specifically I mean by this as we go through. But all of this has a great deal of specific relevance to constructing a customer experience, for constructing the set of feelings, perceptions, thoughts around a particular experience, event, product outcome that a consumer feels, undergoes, experiences, and using that to direct a particular business outcome. And that is, in fact, our objective here today. To provide you with a framework rooted in science, something that we can point to and defend and justify and say, this works and this is why we know it works, that you can then utilize to design your own CX frameworks, interventions, and architectures. So why should you care about this? Well, because basically, if you're in business, behavior matters. Behavior science touches anything where people make choices, make decisions, or do something. That's the overwhelming majority of business interactions and really human interactions. If you do something in your work where people are involved, then you need to be paying attention to what behavior science is, what it says, and how you can most leverage it towards optimizing your own outcomes. So, all of that said, that's a very nice introduction to who we are, but let's jump right into the very specific topic around customer experiences. And as I said, I like to level set when we jump into these talks around what are we actually talking about? So let's open with a question. Let's talk about what is customer experience? I would hope that everybody joining the talk today has some sense or some idea in their own head as to what it is. After all, otherwise, I'm not entirely certain why you might have registered for this, but regardless, welcome. Even if you don't, welcome. But I suspect most people do have some idea in their heads as to what customer experience is. I'd like to converge on a particular set or particular framework so that we can all work from that same common ground. And in doing this, I tend to like to go to the great repository of all human knowledge, Wikipedia. Not because it is the most accurate or most thorough or most correct, it is not, usually is not, but because it typically represents the collective consensus, the population average as to what a particular topic or field means and contains. And if we go to Wikipedia and we look up customer experience, we find this description. Customer experience is a totality of cognitive, affective, sensory, and behavioral consumer responses during all stages of the consumption process, including pre-purchase, consumption, and post-purchase stages. Quite a mouthful. Covers a lot of territory. Basically, what happens to people when they are thinking about a product or service, when they are planning it, when they are utilizing it, and the aftermath of their utilization, purchase, or consumption thereof. That's a lot of territory. And this is a sufficiently broad definition that I'm not sure it provides us with a whole lot of useful directions to pursue or look at or quantify or describe. So if we go deeper into this paragraph, there's actually a section of text that I really, really like. And what it says is, it characterizes CX as the amount of pleasure or displeasure received from savoring future events and a recollection of memories about previous events and experiences of a product or service. Now, this is great. This is a much more constrained and puts it in very straightforward, easily understood terms. The amount of pleasure or displeasure received from savoring future events and a recollection of memories about previous events and experiences. This is really, really interesting because this clearly puts CX on either side of the actual product or service itself. The product itself is really just the product experience, but the customer experience covers both the antecedent and the following elements of it. And this, in terms of how we perceive them, in terms of how we think about them, in terms of how we imagine or recollect them, is enormously important because of the way that our brains work. Because we do not have perfect recollection of the past, and we cannot perfectly predict the future. So there's a measure of uncertainty, of ambiguity, and reconstruction inherent in any CX experience. That's a bit of a redundant statement, CX experience. Sorry, I'll work on that. And this is very important for reasons that we'll get to in just a moment. Let's take a look at what is the shape of CX here and now today. What does the scope of practice typically look like? Well, there are a number of fields and spaces that it tends to focus on. And this, as let's say, an abbreviated short list, many people look at emotion, look at positive feelings. They work towards customer centricity, brand image, ethics and responsibility, and a comprehensive experience beyond the product itself. And this all slots in very neatly with what we just described. And this, I think, covers the bulk of what most people will typically, if you work in a CX role, will typically work towards, will build around. And as a consumer yourself, this is probably what you will encounter for the most part. This is what you will experience yourself. And these goals, these targets, are typically engaged through channels of communication, persuasion, and interaction. So this is really interesting because these are all more or less direct mechanisms and modalities of communication from somebody on the CX side or from a message on the CX side to the consumer themselves. There are very few things that are specifically created or worked towards that are embedded around what happens afterwards. And I realize it's a bit vague, and I'll get to what I mean when we start talking about memory elements. But basically, the bulk of CX interactions are focused on direct connection. And this can lead to some interesting effects. And so what I'm kind of hinting at, and what I think is clear, and there really is no surprise because this is a big part of why we put this talk together, is despite the fact that we have this really well-defined and, to be fair, very well-established and well-developed toolbox and set of targets for CX, very often CX efforts don't work the way we want them to. So let's look at the question of why does CX fail? Now, when we talk about CX failing, I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about customers walking away with a negative experience. As I said, we have a pretty good toolbox around this. We understand what it takes to make somebody like something, what it takes to make somebody enjoy something. There are efforts, yes, that occasionally do not produce this, but by and large, we're pretty good at understanding how to make people have a good feeling, have a positive experience around a product, service, or event. So, in point of fact, these efforts seldom fail, but they don't always lead to the desired business outcomes. This is a really important point. CX is not an end in and of itself. If you have an experiential product or service, for example, let's say Disney, then okay, then yes, the experience actually is the business outcome. But if you sell eggs, the CX is not a business outcome. The business outcome is how many eggs did you sell? And how many dollars did you take in? And how many repeat customers did you have? And what was your marketing spend? The CX is a mechanism by which you can both get to those outcomes and measure the efficacy of many of your efforts. If a customer has a very strong experience, a very positive experience, then you have a sense that you're doing something right. And ideally, that very good, very positive experience with your product, with your brand, with your service will lead to future purchases, will lead to greater spends, will lead to repeat customers, will lead to them becoming evangelical around your brand and bringing in other consumers. But that doesn't always happen. Why? Why does this not always happen? Why does bringing somebody a really positive, pleasant, affirmative experience not always result in them becoming more ardent supporters of your product, your product? This happens because of a very straightforward but subtle observation, one that I hope is not terribly controversial. And this would be that Attitudes, emotion, and behavior come from the brain. I hope that this is not controversial in any way. I think this is very consistent with what we all know and understand about biology, about anatomy, from our history with both neuroscience and psychology. I think we all generally can accept that attitudes, emotion, and behavior come from the brain. So if this is so obvious, then why are we talking about it? Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because there are some really important implications that arise from this. Our brain is a part of our body. It is an organ. And as such, like the rest of our bodies, like the rest of our organs, it has been subject to evolutionary pressures. Our brains have been shaped by environment, by generations and millennia of pressures around us to do very specific things very well. And within these fields of very specific things, we actually do them very well. Our brains are built for things like keeping us alive, like helping us find food, like imploring us to reproduce. And in these directions of behavior, we're very good at these sorts of things. Our brains are not evolved for things like modern business practice, like very precise quantitative comparisons, or decisions between multiple points of uncertainty, or very complex social structures. These are things that, if you look at the evolution of the human species, are very, very recent, 2,000 years old at most, and nowhere near long enough for our brains to adapt. And because of this, there are these layers of processing, these programs that are always operable, these ones that have kept us alive for the last 200,000 years, that are always going, but that we don't really think about because they're wired so deep into us that we're not really aware of them. The last few years has seen people become more and more increasingly aware of these sorts of pre-conscious and deeply embedded survival programs and instinctual effects. One of the most famous is the researcher Dan Ariely, also out of Duke University. He wrote this very well-received book, Predictably Irrational. And this kind of kicked off a very popular collective consciousness around human behavior is irrational, and we don't make choices well, and we make mistakes here and there. I understand why Dan named this book this way. It was very catchy, but in point of fact, we're really not irrational at all. We're just using hardware, we're trying to run software rather, on hardware that was not designed for it. It's the way our brains are operating in modern society is much like as if we were trying to run, Windows 10 on a 1998 machine. You might get some functionality, but it's not going to do everything exactly the way that you want it to. The point in all of this is when trying to understand what people do and how people respond to inputs, it's critical that we always keep in mind what are the original antecedent survival pressures that shaped the behaviors that we've acquired. We look at things like, for example, confirmation bias. Why do we do this? Confirmation bias is one of those very well-known heuristics, I think, that most people are aware of, where we tend to look for things that support what we already believe rather than look to arrive at the exactly precise truth of a matter. Well, because in a survival context, it really doesn't matter if you're exactly precisely correct. It only matters that you are just correct enough to survive. And so we've developed and entrenched these layers of processing that we, as I mentioned before, we very often are not aware of at all, but they continue to drive our behavior. And even further, as a part of this, there is the confounding factor that these different types of processing, these different layers of thought, do not exist uniformly throughout the brain. They exist in different regions of the brain. They exist in different parts. For example, there's a region of the midbrain. I'm not going to go deep into the neuroscience, much as I would love to. It's not serve any of our purposes here today. But there's one part of the midbrain that is responsible for all reinforcement and punishment effects. There's one cluster of neurons that releases dopamine, and that is responsible for reinforcement and punishment. Well, this region of the brain has exactly nothing to do with emotion. And neither of those two regions have anything to do with logical processing. And so we have these competing types of processing, of thought, that all converge to produce the collective behavior that each person emits. But they don't all have the same weight. That is to say, the more young regions of the brain, the cortex, the frontal and the prefrontal regions of the brain, don't actually have a huge amount of input into what we ultimately do. The more primitive regions of the brain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, the brain stem, actually have much, much greater influence in terms of what our overall behavior is going to be. And this is because these regions of the brain are responsible for survival functions. These do things like they help us breathe, they regulate our heart rate, they help us digest food and process nutrients. And so basically, evolution does not want us to subvert these regions. So any sort of processing that occurs in these regions is much, much stronger. Now, the punchline of all of this is that things like our information processing, things like our emotions, are all contained within these very young regions of the brain. That's not to say that emotion and reason and information have no influence on our behavior. They actually have quite a strong influence on our behavior. But they have to pass through all these other layers of processing as well. And they are substantially influenced by them. And so we have to be aware of what's going on with these deeper layers of processing so that we can understand how a CX design is ultimately going to manifest in total. With that in mind, let's go ahead and talk through some principles of CX design. What can we do to take into account these deeper layers of processing and make them work with what we know about information and emotion to create both a positive CX and an effective business outcome for our organizations? First principle that we typically fall back to is one that is, some would say it is a bit like sorcery, and some would say it's a bit like heresy. Depending on which groups I speak to, it's received either with apprehension or with outright rejection. And this is that liking is not the same thing as wanting. The bulk of our CX interventions are focused on making people like a brand, making people like an experience or a product or a person. And this is great. This is all well and good. But liking, as we mentioned, this is an emotion that occurs in the cortex, in the front part of our brain. Wanting is not the same thing at all. Wanting is a consequence of dopamine neurons in the midbrain. I'm not going to go into the neuroscience of exactly what this means. If anybody has interest, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I will put my email address up at the end of the presentation, and we can talk through this in inordinate detail. Always happy to do so. But what this basically shows is a mechanism by which we learn to chase after things and pursue things and ultimately crave things. And this has very little to do with how pleasurable we find them or how enjoyable we find them. If you want to take a very extreme example of this, if you talk to people who have entrenched problems with heroin or cocaine, they'll describe that they don't really like it at all. They have no particular enjoyment from the drug, but they desperately need it. They have to have it. They crave it. And so liking and wanting are not the same thing. In a CX context, I mean, obviously this is, the drug use example is very exaggerated, and it's the sort of thing that we would never encounter at that degree, but the overall premise holds. Just because somebody likes something does not mean that they have a specific inclination to pursue it, to chase it, to go after it, to purchase it. Following from this, we have another one that is similarly received as heresy, particularly within a lot of people from very traditional marketing backgrounds, which is that attitude follows behavior. I'll let you read that again. Attitude follows behavior. This seems impossible. This seems phenomenally counterintuitive. It seems like you're talking about the effect creates the cause. But the research is robust. The research shows this is true. Attitude is something that happens very slowly within our brains. Behavior happens quite quickly. And we typically look to what we are doing. We look at what our own behavior is to determine how we feel about something. There was a very famous experiment in the, I want to say 60s, Leon Festinger, looking at something called cognitive dissonance, phenomenon some of you may have heard of. Lately, it's more frequently referred to as inference, where individuals were asked to do very mindless, pointless tasks. Like, for example, a pegboard, they were asked to hammer pegs into a board over and over and over again. That ultimately would just fall out the other side. The pegs would not stick. It was not a completable task. There was no degree of measurable progress. And their experimental task was to do this for an hour. Now, there were two collective conditions here. There was a group of individuals who were paid to do this, and there was a group of individuals who just were asked to do it. And in asking them afterwards, how much did you enjoy this? Would you recommend this experiment to your friends? The individuals who were paid said, no, this was boring. I did not enjoy this at all. I'm not telling my friends to come here. The individuals who were not paid, in contrast, said, yeah, actually, this was kind of fun. Many of them said, absolutely, I'm going to go tell my spouse, I'm going to tell my friends to come do this. Many of them asked for more time after the experiment had concluded to go back and engage in that mindless menial task again. So the attitude was actually a consequence of what they had done before. For those who were paid to perform in it, they inferred from their own behavior that I only do this because I am compensated to do so, because I am incentivized to do so. Those who were not paid took from this that, hey, I must actually enjoy this. This must be something that I find reinforcing. Otherwise, why would I have spent the last hour doing it? So aligning behavior to the experience that you want to create is critical, and in fact can help create a great deal of the experience that you want. Making it constraining behavior in such a way as to not produce an aversive, restricted experience, but aligning it in a direction that results in that positive feeling, or at least results in an outcome that is consistent with, is congruent with a positive CX, is in fact one of the best ways to create a genuine positive CX that results in beneficial downstream business outcomes. So I'm going to move a bit away from overt behavior and talk about something that I personally have a great deal of interest in, and this is memory. Memory, as we talked about, is really important in the context of CX because much of the customer experience comes both before and after the event itself, the product itself, the service. So there is a requisite and essential contribution of memory to CX. This can create problems, or more accurately, it can create complications, because nothing exists in isolation. We can encode individual concepts in our brain. We can encode the idea of a product. We can encode the idea, the notion of this pen that I have in my hand. But I can't specifically encode writing with the pen. Any experience with the pen that I remember, I'm going to remember what is sitting next to me. I'm going to remember what is going on around me. I'm going to remember what happened before and after it. And so any sort of episodic memory, which is part of my experience, is going to have a contribution from everything that exists around me. Now, this doesn't necessarily sound especially problematic, but it exposes you to a lot of elements that you can't specifically control. I'm going to bring up an example here. I actually want to emphasize that I personally am a huge fan of both of these brands, Chipotle and Five Guys. I actually lived in DC for a number of years while Five Guys was spinning its way up, and I have a great deal of love for the organization. But let's say you have somebody who is an ardent burger lover. and goes to Five Guys for their cheeseburger. They go to this particular location that I have put up here on the screen, which is adjacent to a Chipotle. Now, fairly or not, Chipotle is associated with a number of food contamination episodes over the last 10 years or so. And if somebody is specifically sensitive to this, maybe they've suffered food poisoning themselves, maybe they work in a hospital, maybe they work in public health. Even if they are a devout Five Guys lover, this is not going to create a really good memory for them, going to this particular location, because there is an associative memory of the surrounding environment that has nothing to do with the brand, has nothing to do with the product, but is inescapable otherwise, because that's how our brains encode memories. They take the entire context of what we have done. What this means is, in designing your CX, you have to make sure that the memory follows your customer home. The memory, the experience, cannot end at the doorway. We do a lot of work with what we call cued recall, embedding elements of stimuli into an experience so that when somebody goes through their normal day-to-day life, those same elements prompt them to remember the brand, the message, the experience of their own accord. And this is a way to sort of bypass this problem of associative memory. By seeding your own brand's memory, by seeding your own brand's elements, and having people recall it in an environment that you know is safe, in their home, in a place where they are welcome, that is a fortress for them, then you can avoid much of this contamination of associative memory. So from this, we also want to talk about gravity. What do I mean by gravity? We are aware of the physics definition, that something that has a great deal of mass exerts a great deal of physical attraction of nearby objects. In a behavioral sense, gravity is the very same thing. That is to say, that a behavior that has a lot of participants will then draw a great deal of subsequent participants to it as well. The example I've used a number of times is, imagine you're walking down the hallway at your office. You're walking towards a meeting with your boss, and coming down the same hallway in the opposite direction at the same time are 200 people going in the opposite direction purposefully and with intent. At a bare minimum, you're going to stop and look around and figure out, should I be going this way too? What's going on? This is an example of gravity. If one person walks past you in the opposite direction, you think nothing of it. 2 people, also very little. 10 people, you're going to start giving it some thought. 200 people, most people aren't even going to question it. They're going to turn and start walking and then ask, hey, what's going on? One of the more glib characterizations of this that I've heard is a response to that classic parental imploring of, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you? And the answer is, yeah, well, probably yes. Because what's more likely? That all of my friends spontaneously went insane at the same time, or that there's a bus speeding at us and we have to jump off the bridge to survive? We take cues from people around us to figure out what is the most appropriate behavior. This is most powerful when we ourselves are not certain of what is exactly correct, of what is the best course of action. But with sufficient gravity, with sufficient people already performing a particular action, it doesn't matter. Even if we're already committed to another behavior, that gravity can pull us in. And this is a reason why many very well-constructed CX campaigns can fail. Because you may have a phenomenal experience that very effectively pulls people along in a direction, but if there is sufficient gravity of a competing brand, of a competing or even orthogonal task, product, or experience, it won't specifically matter. So understanding what that surrounding context is enormously consequential. And this interacts very strongly with that notion of attitudes follow behavior. In that notion of, or that example rather, that we just discussed, where sufficient gravity can pull somebody away from even a very good customer experience, well, then what's going to happen? if we construct our attitudes from our behaviors, that individual is going to say, well, I experienced this product, I experienced this service, but I didn't go with it. I engaged in a different behavior. I followed along a different service or different direction. Excuse me. I must not like it very much. This must not have been a very good customer experience. So understanding what the gravity of a particular context is, where your brand sits relative to that, and how to position your own customer experience to take advantage of or to avoid that is critical. In a similar direction, let's talk about, since we're talking about gravity, let's move on to a different physical law, and let's talk about inertia. Inertia is yet another term that we take from physics. For those of you who may not recall, inertia is the tendency of objects at rest to stay at rest and objects in motion to persist in motion. That is to say, things tend to keep doing what they are already doing. This is true of behavior. People tend to keep doing what they are already doing, regardless of what happens around them. And if you need any example of this, I point you only to both the 2016 and 2020 US presidential elections. People stick with things that they know how to do. There is a wonderful term in the behavioral literature, the low cost of doing nothing. It is cognitively easy to not update your behavior, to keep doing what you're doing. Even if there is an obviously better opportunity, an obviously superior path, it requires very little effort and minimal, zero uncertainty to stick with what you already know. So this has two implications. One is that inertia is going to be really tough to overcome. In fact, in virtually every business context, inertia is the single most problematic force that you need to overcome in converting customers' behavior and in delivering a good customer experience. The second thing, and it's imperative to keep this in mind at all times, is that when you're talking about new customers, you're talking about people with whom you have not interacted, people who are unfamiliar with your brand, who do not have established behaviors around your brand, around your product or service, you have to change their inertia. And this can be uncomfortable. What happens when you are riding in the car and you slam on the brakes? You go flying against the seatbelt, and that's a really uncomfortable thing. Your inertia has changed rapidly and precipitously, and it's not a fun thing to experience. This occurs the same way in behavior. Trying to convert people 180 degrees all at once is very, very problematic. In terms of how to deliver a good customer experience, don't look to change their behavior. Don't look to change their experience or change their inertia. Look first to align your own experience with what they're already doing. And then from that, don't look to just flip them 180 degrees or even 90 degrees, but look for continuous and gradiated change. You know, in the case of the braking here, the braking example, going from 60 to 0 over this course of 100 feet is pretty unpleasant. But going from 60 to 0 over the course of half a mile, you barely notice that. Incremental change is essential and critical to overcoming this notion of behavioral inertia. And then finally, let's talk about ease. This is one of the most important premises in all of behavioral science. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about CX, marketing, communications, sales, complex behavioral conversion. Make it easy is one of the most critical tools you need to have in your toolbox. Kurt Lewin was a psychologist in the 1940s and 50s who did a lot of work in a space called field theory. We don't need to go into the details of that, but Lewin found that most behaviors, all behaviors in fact, are a balance of the forces that drive them to happen, the forces that facilitate them happening, and then the external environmental forces that prevent them from happening. So the drivers of behavior and the barriers to behavior result in whatever we do or don't do. Intuitively, it seems that the best way to get somebody to do something, to feel something, to experience something, is to increase those driving forces, to increase that intrinsic motivation or the desire or will to do something. But what Lewin found, in point of fact, was, well, actually, no. Actually, the best way to get somebody to do something, the best way to redirect behavior, to redirect attitude, to redirect experience, is to reduce those limiting forces. Get rid of the barriers as much as you possibly can. Make it easy. Easiness is the best way to get somebody to try something new, to get them to stick with something, and to get them to have a compelling and simple, straightforward experience. Now, easiness actually has a few different dimensions. There are the physical dimensions of ease. And this can be something as simple as if you have a brick and mortar based business, are people able to get to your stores? This is a very simple, straightforward barrier that if it's sufficiently difficult, it doesn't matter how good your CX is. It doesn't matter how good your product is. If people have a sufficiently high barrier, they're just not going to be able to get there. So that's a very extreme example of physical ease. But just as important is cognitive ease, ease of processing, ease of thought. People don't like to spend unnecessary energy. Again, it's a consequence of how our brains are built. We're built to be efficient. That's the charitable way of saying it. Some more cynical anatomist will say that we're built to be lazy. The net outcome is the same. We are built to conserve energy and not expend more than we need to. But as a consequence, we don't like exerting more thought than we have to. We don't like having to chew through a complicated or difficult decision or complicated or difficult experience. If you have a phenomenally good customer experience, but it requires a lot of effort for people to get through, that's really no different than having a bad customer experience. For an example of this collective both ease of action and ease of thought in the real world, let's look way back. Let's look back, it's 2021, let's look back 23 years, and I'm showing my age here a bit, to when I was in college and was starting to use search engines. And the #1 search engine that everybody used was something called Lycos. Some of you may remember this. Lycos was the search engine that we all used. And some of you may recall the landing page for the Lycos search engine. You see it here on the left. Well, that same year, this little upstart organization called Google launched with a radically streamlined front page. You see over here this, whereas Lycos had so many options, so many different features and abilities and things you could possibly use it for, Google had one interface. You could type in the bar that the topic that you wanted to search for, and then you had two options: search or I'm feeling lucky. That's it. That is as streamlined as you can get. Google was cognitively easy to use. Lycos had far more features, had far more bells and whistles, many more colors, and much more complex graphics. Google was easy. That was their advantage at the time. Obviously, things have changed substantially in the years since, but in 1998, the advantage Google had over every other search engine was it was easy. Well, we all know how that one turned out. I believe I've not heard of Lycos since 2002, and except for Bing, I don't think any other search engines really exist anymore. Yahoo, that's right, sorry. So Yahoo and Bing still do exist, but simplicity and ease, reducing the number of keystrokes necessary, reducing the number of clicks necessary, and reducing the amount of thought created this incredibly attractive, incredibly easy to convert platform. And this interacts with our notion of behavioral inertia. How do you get people to change their inertia? How do you get them to try a different behavior? How do you get that first opportunity to redirect them towards your brand, towards your experience? You make it easy. You reduce the barriers to them trying it. So this is a handful of principles and premises that we utilize every day in terms of putting together a customer experience that engages and aligns with the emotional and subjective drivers that we want our customers to experience. So what does this look like in action? I mean, this is wonderful in terms of a conceptual discussion, but how do we apply this actually in a real project? Well, let's look at a case study here. And we want to talk about a case study where we deployed these customer experience principles to create a workplace environment that redirected people towards a beneficial and desired work state and behavioral state. And this was with a large multinational quasi-governmental organization that had a lot of questions and a lot of issues around carbon footprint and sustainability. And in digging in around their own practice and their own employees, they found a number of really interesting findings. They found that there was actually, unsurprisingly, a whole lot of inertia around people's behavior, around these employees' behavior. Regardless of what their stated intent was, regardless of whether they said, I fully support green initiatives, or if they said, I don't really think it's that important, it's exaggerated, was immaterial because their habits were all very well established. There was a general vague support for these pro-sustainability behaviors, but because attitude follows behavior, these attitudes didn't really translate to much. Because they were already just sticking with what they had already done, what they had always done, these attitudes of support were actually not nearly as high as we would want them to be. And in digging in and looking at what was accepted and what was not accepted, we found that there actually was a fair amount of resistance to change, not because people said, oh, I don't like the environment, I don't think it really matters, but because these environmental initiatives required them to change their behaviors. It required them to change what they were already doing. And this was an aversive practice for them. This required them to do things that intellectually had nothing to do with, or in their own heads, I should say, had nothing to do with the environment, but had things to do with, like, they were losing job perks, like, for example, travel to conferences in Sao Paulo, or a very frou-frou cafeteria that brought in, Michelin star chefs once a week. These are things that were just job perks. These were things that were not in their head part of a green initiative. So what we did around this was we built out a tiered structure of experience and interventions, of behavioral interventions. These, to be most effective, really need to be deployed hand in hand. Behavior is not the same thing as CX. They're related. They are absolutely related, but they aren't the same thing. But both are most effectively changed when they are simultaneously engaged. And so that's what we did here. We built out a tiered framework of attitude conversion, of behavioral conversion, all around the experience. And what we did was, as we talked about in the principles earlier, align them with small behavior changes, made some very easy behaviors for them to participate in that you could not make any reasonable objection to. Such as, for example, reduction of litter. This is something that, nobody is going to say, oh, I support littering. I support huge amounts of plastic waste. But by getting people to participate in this, by making it easy for them to participate in these behaviors, they became, well, advocates. They became, in many cases, evangelists. These very small behavior changes over time resulted in very profound changes in attitude. And once we had changed this attitude, we could then go ahead and start making the tough asks. Changing their behavior around, say, recycling plastic, that doesn't really affect their job their job perks in any way. But now, once they became advocates, now it's much easier to ask them, okay, we need to limit you to one remote conference per year. Well, that would have been a very, very tough ask, 6 months prior to this. But because they had gone through that experience of becoming evangelists or advocates at a minimum, all of a sudden, this was actually a very easy ask. This required a much smaller change in attitude, a much smaller change in behavior. And we could align it through the experience itself and not just through constraint. through imposition of new rules. And from this, we went through to internalization. How do we then get this to become an institutional attitude? How do we get this to become an institutional experience, not just one that an individual employee goes through? And then from that, how do we get this to become self-perpetuating? How do we get the people who are experiencing it, who are going through this experience, to then downstream become the agents who execute that experience? How do we turn them into, how do we make them the individuals, the agents who convert the subsequent new arrivals? And I can't tell you how tiers 3 and 4 turned out yet, because we're still working on that. But tiers 1 and 2 have been phenomenally successful in both cultivating this new attitude, as well as seeing measurable, meaningful changes in carbon footprint and sustainability practice. And so at this point, we're getting very short on time. Sorry, I've been going on for quite a bit here. Just want to review what we've discussed and talk through some conclusions here. So we've talked through these specific points around how our brains influence and interact with the subjective and emotional and attitudinal components of a customer experience. We talked through how emotions and behavior come from the brain. And because of this, there are things that we can and cannot do, and things that we are built for and things that we are not built for. Similarly, attitudes and decisions happen in different parts of the brain. Different regions of the brain are responsible for different things, and as such, certain phenomena, certain functions have greater weight, have greater impact in terms of what the overall attitude and behavior of an individual is likely to be. Liking is not the same thing as wanting, and attitude follows behavior. These are these two notions that sound a little bit like I'm making stuff up and pulling your leg, but the research and data supports them robustly. Making somebody want something is typically far more effective than making somebody like something in terms of creating outcomes. And to convert attitude and create receptivity, it's more effective to change their behavior. We talked through the importance of structuring associative memories in such a way that you don't get contamination, or at least you are aware of what contamination from environmental and context comes in with it. We talked through the difficulty of gravity and inertia in terms of things that are going to resist changes to behavior and influence and redirect an experience we hope to convey. And the importance of making things easy. And if you take nothing away from this, take away that point number 8, make it easy. Everything you do will be so much more effective and so much more, well, easy if you internalize this point and work on making things easy for your customers. And with that, I'm going to pause and say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have at this point.
Great, Don. This is Steve again, back with you from day one. We have some questions for you, and I will pose some here if you're ready. One attendee says, what happens when a previously good CX, or it could be EX, but at any rate, experience has a bad episode for whatever reason? How do brands fix that bad impression that came after the good?
Great question. So I will qualify this by saying that I am by training a research scientist, so I tend to answer start my answer to most questions with "it depends," so be aware of that. It does depend somewhat on how much positive experience that individual has had a priori. If somebody is a new customer, and somebody has had very little experience with the brand before, then that negative CX, that negative experience that they have, is going to carry outsized weight. It's going to be the only influence point that you've had with that particular individual, or one of the only. And as such, it's going to have very, very potent influence. At that point, probably the most effective way to recover that individual would not be directly, but would be through gravity and inertia in other people, in hopefully creating enough of a social structure around them and around their peer group that they're recovered naturally. If somebody has had a substantial or established experience with your brand, and then they do have this negative episode, then it matters less. I will not say it doesn't matter at all. Obviously it matters, but the inertia is already in your favor. And recall, people tend to keep doing what they are already doing. It's a well-established premise for all sides of the political aisle that people regularly say, I don't like my candidate. I don't like what they did. I don't like my incumbent, but they go ahead and vote for them anyway, because that is their inertia. Now, it's not a good habit to rely on this. It's really, really not a great habit to say, well, we've got the inertia going for them, so we're going to keep doing it. We're not going to worry about them. We're just going to hope that nothing problematic happens. But one of the things that we didn't really go into in depth because we didn't have time to go through the neurophysiology when I talk about liking versus wanting is mechanisms of reinforcement are such that it relies on something called prediction error. That is the magnitude of difference between what you expect and what actually happens. So in the case of somebody who's had a negative experience with your brand, who is an established customer, their prediction error is going to, at that point, be expecting something low. If you come back after that and over deliver, even once, even just one time, you're going to have a much, much greater reciprocal positive experience on their side, and they'll be that much easier to recover. That was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope that addresses the question.
I think yes, I think you also answered, Corey Bennett, one of our audience members, said, if someone has a negative experience, how many good experiences does it take to erase their negative thoughts? It sounds like it's a kind of more complex contextual thing too, about other people's experiences.
It is, yes. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Audience member named Jason Feldman says, thanks, John, very interesting. My question is, how can a startup or small business utilize this deep science on a practical level, like how they design their website, other than make it easy?
Great question, and I suspect I may know Jason. If this is who I believe it is, great to hear from you again. And this is one of the questions that we get with a great deal of regularity. There is this perception, perhaps justified, perhaps not, that applied behavioral science and applied neuroscience is only workable, only applicable in the context of really large organizations. In point of fact, I would argue quite the contrary. I would argue that because small businesses are dealing with much smaller populations and can't rely on things like inertia and gravity to nearly the same extent as larger organizations, this tactical deployment of behavioral science is that much more important because these other dimensions are all that you have available. In terms of how do you deploy them, it's very difficult to come up with a boilerplate answer for that because it really depends a great deal on what is the nature and structure of your business. What is the nature and structure of what you're doing? If you're doing something that's entirely online, that's going to be something that's very different than if you have a face-to-face brick and mortar operation than if you have a services 2 or 3 man shop. In very broad terms, reinforcement is usually the best way to bring people on board repeatedly and develop that habit. If somebody does not have any inertia around a particular product, around a particular brand or set of services, then reinforcement is the best way that you can bring somebody on board and direct them towards that inertia that you want them to have. Now, again, reinforcement is not the same as them liking something. And very critically, reinforcement is not the same thing as incentives. And this is one that I can see I'm already starting to blather on here. I'm very happy to engage in a detailed and nuanced discussion of how you can specifically apply reinforcement to a very specific business question. But if I try to generalize, I will be going on for the next 30, 40 minutes here. So please feel free to reach out and we can talk that through in greater detail. In fact,
we are at that point where we have to wrap up, John, but we're getting questions from people who would like to see the recording. And I would like to tell them that watch for an email and you'll have a link within about 24 hours. And then there will be a story not too long after that. So here we are. It was fascinating, John. Thank you. Very insightful. We also want to thank your firm, BVA Nudge Unit, and all of you folks who participated today. If you'd like to join us for more virtual events, you can head to our website, fromday1.co, and check out more of our upcoming webinars. One in particular is next Wednesday, January 20th, when we'll be hosting our virtual half-day conference on acquiring skilled talent in 2021. How has the market changed? Thank you, John, and thank you everyone who attended. Stay well.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day.